freak and like to order people around. But given the numbers again for this session, I'd like to suggest that you sort of congregate more closely together. And so if you don't mind moving in, and in fact, given the numbers also, I hope that you'll treat this somewhat less formally than we have the other sessions. And after the members of the panel have spoken briefly, then I would hope that you would consider this more a conversation than a question and answer period, and feel welcome to comment on what they have to say and add to from your perspective. So please feel as we begin this that you should play an active role and have something to say as well as the panel. As we were thinking of this final panel, I think part of our idea was that we do see a fairly serious set of problems that grow out of the conditions that we're talking about. There is a sense of loss of hope and feelings that the prospects for the future are dim at best. There's a sense that we are in decline rather than a sense of optimism that the world is worse off today than it was 20 years ago, and that decline is bound to continue. The response that we often worry about is that people are withdrawing. There's long been in the literature talk of people withdrawing into sort of their own little fortress that we hide behind for you younger people. Video games, us older people hide behind debates about athletics and the significant features of the NFL and the NBA and the NCAA, and we spend much time debating those and ignoring the sorts of things that Najimi especially was talking about earlier today. But this idea of withdrawing and in a sense denying problems, and then a willingness on the parts of certain parts of our population to abandon sort of the stable and cherished kinds of traditions that are present, including things like a acceptance of election outcomes, the loss of a interest in questions of truth, and shifting to empty rhetoric that really offers very little more than just the squabbling of ducks. And so what we want to do with this particular panel is to discuss what do you see in the future. And I'd like to suggest you take this in two ways. One is become prophets and tell us what the future holds for us. And then secondly, how do you suggest that we go about making a future that deals with this pessimism and offers hope and reasons for engagement and optimism? And with that, let me introduce our panel to you. The panel that we have is three of our invited guests who have come as both facilitators in the workshop and then are with us here for this conference today. Each one of them has a very important experience, and part of, I think, my pleasure with doing this, and this panel in particular, is that over a process of a couple of years, I feel like we have become friends, and this is a kind of friendly engagement here. But on my left, we have Carl Stauffer. Carl is a specialist in transformation and reconciliation. He works at the United States Institute of Peace. He's had an enormous amount of experience in the field in various parts of the world, and is now very actively engaged in dealing with things like the ways in which we can become reconciled with places like Vietnam. Carl has been a professor at Eastern Mennonite University, and brings with him that background and faith. And then we have Rae
Kyritsi.
Kyritsi.
There it is. Perfect.
That is not a problem with Rae's last name, it's a problem with my old age. But we have Rae Kyritsi with us. She has been with the Mediation Center in Chicago. She has had an enormous amount of experience in mediating a variety of problems related to legal contests, and she is now moving on to new endeavors, but she brings this enormous amount of experience with mediation. And then we have Michael Minch. Some of you know Michael. He is retired from here is the wrong word. He is an alumnus of Utah Valley University, in the sense that he was one of those people who has built the philosophy department here and has founded the Peace and Justice Studies program. He was the moving force behind Peace and Justice Studies for over a decade. And the university here is deeply indebted to him for his endeavors in the way in which he developed a student culture here that carries an interest in issues of peace and justice, and a dedication to not simply being interested in it, but engaging actively in dealing with injustice. And I think that's something that's impressive about all three panel members. They don't just talk about these things, they've dedicated their lives to active engagement. And so what we will do is each, starting with Carl, will take about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll move to the conversation with you. So, Carl.
Wave both arms. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you all for those of you who are staying for this last session. Hopefully it'll be an engaging time. Where do we go from here? I'm going to carry on from the last few, maybe the whole day, with the storytelling. So in 2001, many of you know I lived in, or some of you know that I lived in South Africa for many years, about 16 years. And in 2001, my South African colleagues and I were invited to come into a conflict in about 35 different small villages that spotted a mountainous region in South Africa, rural region. And these were under traditional chieftaincies, And one of the villages was responsible for killing a chief, murdering a chief in the 1960s, and a spiral of violence broke out and was continuing all the way up until 2001. This violence grew from sort of revenge around stealing stock, stealing cattle, to gangs starting to shoot at each other. And in December of 1998, 16 people were killed in one gun battle, and the army was called in and so on. In 2001, the sort of precipitating, triggering factor was that two young women in full uniform heading to high school were walking with their book bags and were caught in the crossfire of these gangs shooting and were killed. And the community said, we're finished with this. This is enough. We need to figure out how to stop this once and for all. So the local leaders and pastors, religious leaders and traditional leaders invited us through the auspice of the South African Council of Churches to be engaged there. And there are many stories around that month-long and many months-long engagement, but the one that is most startling and was a turning point in our process was we were gathering the villages together and doing a certain amount of storytelling and capacity building and conflict analysis and just trying to get folks together on the same page. But there was one village that everyone blamed for the violence, and it was that village that never showed up to any of our meetings. So we had been going in and holding these meetings for some 3 months before we had this experience where we were holding this meeting with multiple villages, and a delegation walked in to the building, the church building we were in, late. And everyone turned and looked, and by the expressions and the murmuring, we realized that we suddenly were graced with the presence of a delegation from the village that was being blamed for the violence. And they were prepared to engage, or at least talk. And so we gave them the stage, and the spokesperson for their delegation began to talk. And as he began to tell the story, he started to talk in a way that was a peacemaker's nightmare. He began to talk only about everything that his village had lost, all the stock and all the cattle and all the people, and he made no reference to any harm that his village may have caused. And so, as you can imagine, the group that was gathered of these other villages began to get stir crazy. I mean, there was murmuring and wrestling, and it was getting messy, and we were like, we're going to lose control of this process. Not that we controlled it at all, but this whole process is going to go out of turn very soon. And so we gathered together as the leadership and said, what do we do? And we took a bit of a caucus break, and we said, I think we made a second decision that we could trust the rest of the villages that we've been working with and plead with them to let them speak out until they're finished, even though we knew it wasn't effectively providing much reconciliation at that point. And so we did that, and the village said yes. The rest of the village said okay, as long as we have a chance to ask questions at the end, and we did give that opportunity. By the end of that evening, when they finished up speaking, there was a number of really well-articulated, pointed questions from the other villages, and it was tense. We ended that village, I was debriefing with Vusi, my colleague, and I said, Vusi, that was a disaster in my mind. I don't know what happened, and I don't know what else we could have done differently, but I don't know where this whole process is. I think we're off track. We went back to Johannesburg, and within a few days, we were... the local leadership called us and said, you won't believe what happened. We said, what? And they said, we went to visit this village just to follow up that meeting, not sure what we were going to find. And they welcomed us, and then they sat us down and ate with us. Now, in many traditions, as we all know, sharing a meal together meant there's peace between us. And then he said, that was not all. They said, that's not all. We ate together, and then part of the schema of this intervention was that each village was going to choose 5 people, men, women, and youth, to be trained as mediation, as a prevention mechanism. And these mediation teams would be in regular contact with each other to try to circumvent the violence from continuing in its cycles. And so the leaders said, you won't believe what happened after the meal. They gave us the 5 names of who they want on their mediation committee and who they're going to send to the next training. And none of the other villages had even gotten that far. Now I tell this story because where do we go from here? There is no neat formula for this. This ended up being a kind of healing conversation that we didn't know how we even got there, and I still don't, to this day, know exactly how we got there. I have some theories. It was about recognition. We gave a recognition to these people that they didn't expect, and that recognition allowed them to begin to soften and move into a process. But, you know, there's so many things that didn't happen, like the textbooks tell us should. There was no apology. There was no forgiveness transaction. There was no reparations. What do we do with this? And so where do we go from here? I think we have to grapple with at least three major issues, and then I'll mention a few processes. Legitimacy, you know, what role did legitimacy play in that story? And I think by allowing them to speak out their voice, even though it was not what we wanted to hear, there was a legitimation that was happening. And you could say, well, that's not fair for those who suffered. Absolutely, but this is part of the dynamics. And there's whole books written on the politics of recognition and the idea of dignity, and how do we honor someone's human dignity while at the same time not agreeing with what they've done. And is there ways to do that effectively? The second is power. There is so much power in different ways, negative and positive, through this whole story and through our work. And so when I talk about power, I don't want us to only think about negative power, the power that abuses us or oppresses us or holds violent structures in place. I want us also to think about the power that all of us possess, the power that happens when we come together and honor each other's humanity, the power that happens when we share ideas, the power that we create when we come together and link and build networks and coalitions and move forward. And lastly, there was complexity. I mean, this was a complex situation. We still don't understand the fullness of it, but we had to start to move with the complexity of that current situation and not always knowing where it was going to go. So in line with those concepts of legitimacy, power, and complexity, and I take those from a recent study on narrative engagement across differences. The acronym is NEAD, and this was, the authors are Julia Roig and James Savage, and they were doing some literature review around how narrative engagement across differences, what are the key characteristics. But as I think about this question, where do we go from here? I think we're going to have to concentrate. We're going to have to focus on nonpartisan processes. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to name three that I'm spending a lot of time with these days. The first is trauma. We've mentioned trauma. We've talked about it in bits and pieces throughout these 2 days. But trauma healing, trauma resilience, trauma-informed work, whatever you want to call it, is nonpartisan. We all experience trauma. And the experience of human trauma is a common shared phenomenon, even though what caused the trauma may be very different things. So what does it mean for us to bring the polarized communities and parties together to heal together? To actually look at trauma, to drop the politicking, the ideological bantering, and think about how have we all been traumatized, affected by this work. And can we, one of the questions that's been bouncing around in my mind, I was in the gym and Fox News was on in the gym this morning, and I guess I was really wrestling with, and this could be the same when I listen to NSCBN and whatever, these, on all sides of the polarization. Can we take the fear and the anxiety that drives this polarization and turn that into healing? It's an energy that might be similar. I don't know. I'm asking questions now. I don't have any answers to myself. It might be an energy that it's a negative energy versus a positive energy, but can we rechannel that energy from anxiety and fear into trauma healing work? Dr. Fania Davis, a good colleague and friend of mine, who is a civil rights activist and now a restorative justice promoted practitioner, she burned herself out. She self-identifies as an angry civil rights activist for 25 years and almost burnt herself out, so she left the field and went and got a PhD in indigenous healing. And then came back to California and couldn't get a job, and got pulled back into the court system just to pay the bills, and found restorative justice. And she said, finally, I can bring my warrior self and my healer self together. The second nonpartisan mechanism, approach, tool, whatever you want to call it, is restorative justice. Many of you know that this is an area where I've spent a good deal of my research and writing and practice. And I say this because we have to begin to think about a paradigm shift if this polarization is going to be overcome or bridged. It's going to have to move from justice as punishment to justice as restoration, justice as accountability and restoration, from justice as punishment to justice as embedded in human relationship and community and in this togetherness of healing and restoration. It doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable, but it means that accountability, first and foremost, says you're a human being. What you've done maybe has been very inhumane, but we believe we can restore our humanity together. Restorative justice changes the questions about justice. It says, what is the harm that has happened? Number two, what are the needs, the human needs that have come out of that harm? Because there's always a ripple effect to the harms when we harm each other. And third, who's responsible or obligated to heal or to try to repair the harm that's been done? And that whom is not necessarily always a person, it could be a structure. But when you ask these three questions, they're different questions than our court systems ask. And when we ask these three questions, we get what? Different answers. More creative, more imaginative, which I think can help us think about new ways to bridge this divide. And lastly, and this has to do with the complexity point earlier, we are going to have to get used to working with emergent adaptive systems change. I think we're not going to be able to go back to mechanical analogies of this work. It doesn't work like a computer motherboard. It's not formulaic. It's not staged and stepped and sequenced. This is more like a moving blob that we can infuse various points and see where it goes. It's more, or maybe I'll be a little kinder. It's like the banks of a river that hold the water in, but it moves as it wills. So our job is not so much to dam that water up, but to figure out how do we get into the current and move with it and flow with it. And when I think about emergent adaptive systems, and I think about polarization, I think about the idea that in between this polarization, there's a whole set of activities going on. And if we begin to ask a different set of questions, again, from a systems perspective, and I'll close with this, there are at least three things that we need to think about with emergent adaptive systems. The first is we need to question the containers. What are the containers? The containers are what hold the system and keep the system going. And so what are those forms and shapes and containers that hold the system? And question those and say, are there ways we can change those? Second of all, we have been told there is a difference that means life and death in our situation of this hyperpolarization. And we need to question that difference. In other words, are we all connected as humanity or not? And if we are, how do we find that connection? I was talking with some colleagues just the other day, I was reminded of this concept, times that we go into conflict and violent conflict over what appears to be not significant differences. And I know that's hard to hear in this polarization, because we're being told that, you know, it's our differences are a matter of life and death, as I've already said. And so, but I wonder if we have gotten caught in the narcissism of minor difference, where we're trying to make sure that we look different, we differentiate from that who we are not. And so what does it mean to connect different parts of the system that in the past have said, no, they're not supposed to be together? And then lastly, there's exchanges. All systems thrive on exchanges, reciprocities that keep them going. And I believe that there's a multitude, if not an infinite number of different kinds of exchanges and different reciprocities that we have yet to explore if we can stay in that creative and curious place that was talked about in the last panel, and see where that takes us in bridging this polarization. I've said enough. Thank you.
Yes? All right. Hello, everyone. Easy act to follow, huh? So, thanks, Carl. I love those ideas, and you have like all of this incredible big picture framing, and I'm going to talk about much smaller actions. So, my work is in community mediation, and in Chicago, I run about 20 different mediation programs, and I work with a lot of different types of people with a lot of different types of conflict. And I think, you know, when asked this question, where do we go from here? And Lynn had asked us to sort of proselytize what the future would hold and what we should do. You know, we're sort of starting from this pessimistic perception, I think, today. And I have a bachelor's in philosophy, so I was a great bartender. And then I wanted to be a lawyer, so I used it. It's fine. But I remember when studying Friedrich Nietzsche that he had a problem at one point with this pessimist Schopenhauer, because he would write all day, and write all this really pessimistic stuff, and then he would like put on his tights and go play the fiddle, right? And he was like, you're not really living it, you know? If you're a pessimist, I want you in it all the time. And I think that 20 years ago when I first heard that kind of idea, it made a lot of sense to me, right? I was like, if you're gonna live authentically, we're gonna be upset and be upset all of the time, right? And I think that coming from that place is self-destructive, right? And so I wonder sometimes when I personally feel pessimistic, when I look at the amount of conflict or strife that I feel like we're facing, you know, as a mediator working with thousands of people a year, I have this unbelievable privilege to sit in spaces with a lot of people who are struggling with what might seem like one really small thing, but it's often impacts everything, right? The people who are involved in an eviction case are what we call facing housing insecurity, and it's usually not the only thing that's not going well for them, right? And so it's like, sure, it's a housing case, but also this person is probably struggling with a lot of other things. But when I think about all of that, I realize that in some ways, you know, it's not maybe that things are worse, but maybe that I am paying more attention, right? People have a sensation that when we were children, it was better, right? Each generation thinks that the time they were a child was better. I don't know that the 80s were that great, but like I didn't have bills, you know, like my responsibilities were different. What I was paying attention to was different, right? And I think that while we have new and serious problems, it's also really important to keep in mind that we are not the first generation to face polarization, and we just stand a chance of being the first generation to really manage it well, right? Like we're learning and growing. When I was a barista, I had a regular customer who worked at what was referred to as the drunk tank, right? So she was a social worker, and she worked at a place at the police station where people who got picked up for public intoxication, they had to stay there until they sobered up. And I once said to her, do you see the same people all the time? And she said, oh yeah, for sure. I was like, isn't that heartbreaking for you? And she looked me in the eye and she said, absolutely not. Getting sober is a great habit. And that's actually how I feel when we think about, Clayton Long asked this really beautiful question to the end of the last panel of like, what, is it a one-time thing? How does it work moving forward? And I think that for a lot of these types of resolutions and conversations, it's a habit, it's a practice for neutrals, for practitioners, but also for the people that are engaged in them. We were talking in my breakout group yesterday about how very rarely people come to really big conversations about really important polarizing issues thinking, I'm here to change my mind. I'm just hoping I'll get a little bit of new information and then I was gonna maybe switch political parties today, right? Like, that's not how anybody shows up to those conversations. But if we are gonna learn and grow and shift the conversation or even have conversations, right? If we're gonna organize, right, which is one of the themes on the earlier panel, a lot of that, none of that I think happens in a single conversation, especially if it's not your labor, your service, your work. It is a habit and it is a practice. And it is one that you will sometimes feel like you're having a great success with. And then sometimes you will, like in Carl's story, wonder what worked. And then sometimes I think that everyone I know who works in conflict resolution and peace building has absolutely had cases, incidents, experiences where you went, this is, I don't know if we didn't make it worse, right? Like sometimes it feels like not only did you not solve it, but maybe you didn't even move it forward. But I think that that is also part of the practice and part of the building. As practitioners or regular engagers in this type of work, I also think that something that is really, really missing from our profession broadly is a high value on self-care. Mental health professionals know this. They have this. It's the rules, right? Counselors, social workers, they have a whole systems of how you have to debrief your work, right, with someone else who's more experienced. And so many people I know that work in conflict resolution, peace building, mediation, practice in isolation. And that stuff gets stuck in your belly, right? Emotional contagion is real. Being in shared space with people who are in conflict, you can literally feel it in your bones, in your body. Secondary trauma is real. Holding space so that people can tell their really hard, really important, really beautiful stories, it impacts us. And I think that when we are able to come together in spaces like this is absolutely celebratory. This is so good for the work overall. So I think making sure to continue to engage in shared spaces, not just to teach and learn, but also to care for one another, is a really important thing for me, for when I think about how we move forward and continue to do work. And then also just like simple types of care, simple levels of self-care. When I was 21, I lived in a converted house, so the walls were very, very thin. And my next door neighbor on the other side of the wall was getting a master's in the violin, which was amazing. It was like such a blend of all the things to seep through your neighbor's wall, right? She was a professional violinist, and she was so good. She was like a fill-in for the Orlando Orchestra, right? Like we were in Wisconsin, and she would like go to Orlando and play. She was so talented. Her name is Amelia, and her violin was one of those violins that's like over 100 years old, and her mother had to mortgage the house to purchase it, and it was this just like unbelievably precious possession. And she took such fantastic care of it, right? Because it was the tool for her work. And if you are working in this type of engagement, in this type of field, you're the tool for this work. And I actually bought myself a piece of art with a violin on it to remind myself to treat myself like Amelia's violin. And I would encourage you to treat yourself like Amelia's violin, as if your mother had to mortgage the house to purchase you, right? Like, right, because emotionally she did, right? So, like, shall we all take such care and realize how precious we are and our colleagues are who do this type of work. And then a final really important question for me as a practitioner is recognizing that there absolutely are opportunities and issues and circumstances where I am not the resource. I might want to do it. I might think it would be really cool to get this experience. Someone might offer me the opportunity to come in. But if we're going to avoid, Ben Cook was talking about, right, like avoiding that idea of like parachuting in, right? Like if we're not gonna, we don't wanna come in and just be like, solved it, there's your piece, you're welcome, right? Instead, we wanna like create opportunities and build and look at the resources that communities already have and build from those. I think it really is a very important question to ask. Am I the person for this work? And am I in a place where I can do this work? And recognize that we give and we get when we engage in this work as neutrals, as practitioners, as space creators, but also as parties to these types of really powerful conversations. And so I think that all of that is, remembering that sometimes I might not be the right choice for something, or that I might not be in the place where I can do something, is also okay. There are other people. There's a lot of other people who do this work, and it's really helpful to remember that. And as we've seen from yesterday's workshops and from all the panelists today, there's so many related but unique like perspectives and models and tools, and it's just such an exciting place to be. My wife is from Wisconsin and I am from near Chicago, and those geographically seem very close together, but culturally are very different. And so much so that when we travel, even though we've lived in Chicago for 7 years, when we travel to other places and people say, where are you from? And I say Chicago, she corrects me and says, well, no, actually, I'm originally from Wisconsin. Like, she can't affiliate with being from Chicago. She's so proud of being from Wisconsin. And so I am relocating my home base there in the next few months. But one of my favorite things about Wisconsin is its state motto. And the state motto for Wisconsin is forward. And so when thinking about where do we go from here, I think the answer is forward.
Thank you, both of you. Very nice. I'm going to begin with a word about prophecy, because Lynn invited us to be prophets. So to say just a word about what the words prophet and prophetic mean in the Jewish and Christian traditions. Prophet is not so much about foretelling, but rather truth-telling. But a person gifted with seeing the present truthfully also has a lot of gifts to see the future truthfully. And but it's about truth, and it's about who we are and what the world is, and how to live lives that create a future accordingly. And so I hope there is indeed some of the prophetic in what I'm going to say. I want to say, if we're talking about where do we go from here, I want to endorse every single word that every single person on the panel previous to us said. That's part of where we go from here. I want to endorse everything that Carl and Rae said, every word. That's part of where we go from here. But I also want to be a gigantic outlier to these past 2 days, because virtually all of yesterday and virtually all of today, everything I heard was about a unit of analysis and operation at the individual level. What kind of persons we should be, and how we should be internally the kinds of persons that engage other persons in healing ways. And I haven't heard a word from any of my wonderful colleagues, all of whom I adore, not one word from any of them with which I disagree, right? I strongly agree with it all, but I want to go an entirely different direction. Maybe it's appropriate that I'm the very last person speaking in some way. But I want to think about healing conversations, not only in terms of the dynamics of those conversations and what kind of people we need to be and how we need to hear, how we need to listen, how we need to understand stories and trauma and so on and so forth. I also think of healing conversations that arc in a certain direction about certain things. The reason being is because what brings us here today and yesterday and a year ago, when we began Healing Conversations workshops and Healing Conversations conferences, is this. We live in a time and a place, in a moment in history, in a country, and I don't have time to explain why this is, but all conflict experts agree we are on a path to civil war. And if you think I'm being alarmist, email me and I will try to explain to you why that's truth. It's not alarmism, it's not exaggeration, it's not crazy, it's what it is. We're in an extraordinarily dangerous place, and that's in fact what created these events in the first place. And if we are in that crazy, that dangerous of a place, and we're thinking about where do we go from here, I believe we have to think big. And so everything I'm going to say is going to be a very, very, very big thing. Some of them are gigantic things. We could have week-long seminars on each one of them. Each one of them deserves multiple books. But I think that each and every one of them is feasible, which is to say there's no dispositive analytical reason why they can't happen. And I believe there are a lot of dynamics at work that give fuel to the eventuality of them happening. It's not inevitable that any of them will happen by a long shot, but I believe they are all possible. So, I believe that we inhabit a violence system. That's what we live in. A system that produces violence because it's designed to do that. And I believe you only replace a system with a system. And so I believe that peace builders, conflict transformation specialists, people who work in healing conversations and dealing with trauma and bridging divides have to be people who understand the depth and complexity and power of the violence system we inhabit. And they envision a system of peace and reconciliation which is at least as powerful as that. Okay? So I believe that very strongly. So I want to say that what we need going forward is real, authentic democracy. Not what we have now, which is maybe not democracy at all, and if there's some democracy in our society, it is minuscule. It is anemic, at the best. I want to say three things very quickly that all societies or all states or all associations must have in order to be healthy. The first is that there have to be a sufficient number of people who are sufficiently knowledgeable about the world in the relevant ways. They don't have to be sufficiently knowledgeable about, say, jazz or baseball, although what a tragic deficit if that's not true. But they have to be sufficiently knowledgeable about the world we inhabit in the proper ways, about our politics and our sociology and our social systems and what morality is and so on and so forth. And I don't have time to explain what sufficient means in both of those cases, but you can ask me about that later. That's complicated. Second, we have to live in a society where there are a sufficient number of people who are sufficiently able to think well. They can think analogically, they can think analytically, they can engage in critical thinking, which is to say, they're people who not only have knowledge, but they know what to do with it. Because those are two different things. Having information at hand is not enough. Knowing how to use it is also necessary. The third condition necessary for a healthy society is for a sufficient number of people to take morality seriously. Now, by seriously, I don't mean that they're sincere. I distinguish between sincerity and seriousness. I know there are people who are sincere, but that doesn't mean that their moral claims are very powerful or do as much good. So I mean something about robust morality. And all three of those conditions, I think, are necessary, and I think we are in profound deficit in respect to all three in this country. And so we need to build that into the infrastructure, the culture, the fabric of our society in innumerable ways. One of them has to do with education in schools, formal education, but that's not near enough. Another way to do it is through houses of worship, through religious traditions. That's not enough either. And there are other ways to do it, but we have to build those three capacities into our social fabric, and we have a lot of work to do. Now, I also want to say a few things very quickly, and some of you will roll your eyes. That's okay. And I don't have time to elaborate on any of them, and these are in no particular order, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the other things, since you asked us to be prophetic, Lynn, that I believe we have to do. One is we have to get money out of politics. We have to stop using money to purchase and create political power. We have to end that in all the ways that it can be ended, in all the ways that we do it. Secondly, we need to end the filibuster in the National Congress. Third, the Republican Party needs to kill itself off, or through strategic choices they would make to do that, or they need to kick the authoritarians out of the party and rebuild the party. And I don't know which they'll do, but they have to do one of those two things. Fourth, the Christian church needs a new reformation. What I mean by that is, I think of Germany under the Third Reich, and I think of the confessing church. I think of the Christians who said, you know what? It is impossible to be a Christian and a good German if being a good German means we support this. And they wrote something called the Barmen Confession, and they said all that explicitly. And some of them were sent to their deaths because they said it. We need the same thing. Years later in South Africa, Christians in South Africa wrote something called the Kairos document. They used the Barmen Confession as a model. And in the Kairos document, they said, it is impossible to be a Christian and support apartheid. If you support apartheid, it is evidence you do not understand Christianity. Some years later, in Palestine, Christian Palestinians wrote their own Kairos document. And they said, it is impossible to be a Christian and support what Israel is doing, colonizing Palestinians still on occupied land. You cannot believe in that, you cannot support that, and be a Christian. Those are three models, historic models in recent history we need in our country right now to get rid of Christian nationalism. So that's another thing we have to do. Another thing we have to do is have the kinds of healing conversations that we've been talking about yesterday and today and last year for 2 days across the country. And what I mean by healing conversations is conversations when people are in the room where some of these people would like to kill other people, right? Where some of these people believe that if you really love America, you're willing to kill a Democrat or a liberal, right? There are a lot of people like that in this country. They want to kill people like many of us in this room that think that's the way to love America. We need to sit in spaces with them and have hard conversations with them. You know, I was dismayed earlier today by the panel where some of the members of the Utah legislature essentially said, well, I get along with some Republicans and I get along with some Democrats, and aren't we good? You know, isn't that great? It's fine, but it's so much not enough. It's just so much not enough. You know, we live in times that demand so much more than that, right? So we need to sit down with people who, you know, if given the chance, might want to, speaking of myself, kill me, right? The elimination of me would be good for their understanding of America. I need to talk to them. I need to meet with them. I need to love them. I need to understand them. I need to hear them. I need to experience their lives so that I can express what I believe a different future might look like. One that doesn't demand violence. All right, so that's something we have to do. We have to get rid of assault rifles altogether, and we need to make ammunition for other guns very, 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 very expensive. Why? Because we need to demilitarize the radical right. The radical right in this country is a coalition of paramilitaries, just in case you didn't know. Some of them have support by senators and members of the House of Representatives, and by people who are extremely powerful in the Republican Party because they are billionaires. It's not just a bunch of wackos out there. There are people who want to use their guns and form militaries who have institutional and infrastructural support. We need to demilitarize the right wing. So that's one way to do it. I mean, it's not the only way. I don't have time to say everything after all, right? Okay, we need to have truth in journalism laws. Truth in journalism laws, like we have truth in advertising laws. There are some things you just can't say. It's illegal to say it. You can sell Coca-Cola, but you can't say Coca-Cola will cure cancer. You can't say that. It's against the law. But you can lie and lie and lie and lie and lie about everything on the airwaves, on the radio and on the television, or in print, and it's completely legal, right? The only reason Fox News is being sued is because a particular party is bringing suit because it was harmed. But that's absurd. We're all being harmed. And by the way, Fox News and Alex Jones and all of that group, they use our airwaves. That's public airwaves up there. They lease it from us. Why don't we take the lease away from them when they abuse it? We ought to create truth in journalism laws that penalizes certain abuses and at a certain point says, you know what, we revoke your license. You don't get to use our airwaves to disseminate lies of the most pernicious kind day after day after day, year after year after year. We revoke your license. Yes, there are airwaves. I mean, that's what a democracy would look like. The airwaves belong to the people. Formally, theoretically, but we don't act like it. Another thing we need to do is punish white supremacy and Christian nationalism through informal cultural mechanisms. So, of course, I don't mean we throw, white supremacists in jail. I just mean they should be shamed. They shouldn't be allowed to serve on boards just because other board members wouldn't want them there. They shouldn't be people who get to operate as high-level managers in corporations, for example. Not because it's illegal, just because their colleagues wouldn't want them. We need to revive what in other cultures and other times was a powerful mode of operation called shame. Think of all the people who do shameful things, and when you're standing in line to get your groceries, their picture is on the cover of Newsweek. And it's not because it's shameful, but it's heroic. They're being admired. They're being admired and they should be ashamed. We should shame them. So we need to revive that virtue. And the last thing I'll mention is that we either need to get rid of the Senate. I don't mean at the state level, let's forget that. At the national level, we need to get rid of the Senate, or we need to have a Senate where senators are elected as the way House members are elected, as a reflection of population. I mean, how absurd is it, that Wyoming and North Dakota have the same number of senators as Texas and Florida and California do? What an utter absurdity. Again, if we really wanted to have a democracy, we wouldn't do that to ourselves. That's insane. So on I could go, but I'll stop there.
So what we would like to do now is either panel members or those of you in the audience engage in this conversation. You can ask questions of the panel, or you can make comments about what has been said. And we invite either of those two. And we have a microphone here so that you can be picked up and recorded for eternity.
I can only come from my experience. I was a principal of an elementary school where there were a lot of turnovers because the folks didn't live there. You can't live there. You can't own land on a reservation if you're non-Navajo. So that's one reason why the turnover. You can only be there for a year or two. And the turnover was not constant. It was not sustained for a long time for the community, for the kids. And so because of that, the kids were not engaged, not solid, not whatever. And that disturbed me. I was asked to be the principal, and those are the things that I began to think about. Eventually, even though I didn't think of myself as a leader, principal, I chose to think in terms of a vision. And I thought about things like we are our own people. We go on things like vision quests in our sweat lodges, in our mountains and places like that for ourselves and our family. And so that made sense to me to have a vision for the community, not the school only, but the community. That mission statement that we create, our vision statement that we created, was also at the same time our mission statement. It kind of makes sense because it came out of the community rather than out of one or two or government or county or whatever. It came right out from the children's parents, whoever oversaw the children. Sometimes it's grandma, sometimes a foster parent, sometimes it's the state or whatever. Anyway, they all had somebody over them. And so a vision statement, what I want for my children is what I want for all children. The reason why that was so important is because I wanted every single person, young and old, have a voice to make a change in that little school. And it worked. Everybody believed in their grandchildren or their little kids. What I want for them is this. But I want these ideas to be all children, not just my children. And they really bought into it. So one of the things we might say is, if we want to create a vision for every single one of us in this room and the workers that we have elsewhere, we need to buy into a vision that's just so appealing and so, like, every time we get together, every time we wake up, it makes it that we can, that's the reason why I live. That's the reason why I go to help my children. And that's the reason why I live. And so that was what we did. What I want for my children is what I want for all children. And as I was just sitting here, I thought, oh, that'd be cool if I put together the idea of what it all means. What I want for myself is what I want for every human being. If I want peace, I want it for everybody. If I want good relations, I want it for everybody. Have everybody's, but the decision would be by the group, whatever we implement, and to make it simple, because Hojong demands simplicity. That peace demands that for us, because It wants to be in every heart and every soul. And it is, but we need it to grow. And because of that, we need a statement that's simple, kind of like what Rae said, you know. What did you say? I can't remember. That motto of the
Forward.
state, forward. So simplicity would be the answer to that vision statement. And if somebody has a agenda, you would share it with everybody, and there would be a vote that says, yes, that's the way to change this way of moving forward. Because we all believe that. We all want that. Not just for us, but for young and old. You know? And that's, if we just created that, I think, for me, because I work in my community, we were, in my mind, considered the Blue Ribbon School of the nation, as far as the United States nation. And I thought in those directions. And I thought that we were dealing with the same thing. We're dealing with the nation and the world in a sense. But I think we start with the nation. And they would want that desire that was being desired back in the old days when maybe the democracy was hailed as one of the best. Well, we can recreate that idea through a simple vision statement that everybody buys into. Even a child can buy into that statement. And they can be the voice, because sometimes the children are the most wise among us. That's it.
Thank you, Clayton. Other comments or questions? Gabe?
Michael, it brings me great joy to say that hearing you speak both brings me a lot of joy and also makes me miss you so much. And you did that formative part of my life, so I appreciate you speaking so boldly about these things that really matter. There's a question for the panel. We've talked a lot about healing harms, which obviously means that there are people, there are institutions, there are dynamics doing a lot of the harming. Some folks talk about the status quo and upholding the status quo as part of a problematic part of doing this work. Sometimes we inevitably kind of serve as pressure valves for these systems, right? So part of my question is related to what Michael said about the Republican Party. And I agree that there needs to be foundational reformation within the Republican Party. However, I think the Democratic Party is not doing a very good job. And in fact, in many ways, it's serving as part of this pressure valve for the status quo and the powers that be. I gave an example in our room yesterday about the things that the parties do vote on together. They're pretty consistent about things like war funding, for example, and funding social programs. So the question is, who, in your mind, who at that level do we need to bring to the table that's doing the harming, right? Who are the people that want to kill us at the most violent sense, but who want to take away our services, who want to take our healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera? And in some ways, the question is, what vision are they seeing being fulfilled by the things they're doing that are causing this violence, right? Because if we're assuming best intentions and we're assuming that their humanity, what is the project that they're working on? How do you understand that project? And how do you subsume that into the healing conversations type of project?
Well, that was a very big and sophisticated question, Gabe. Thank you. Well, when I make calls for democracy, what I mean is that all people in very radical and robust and egalitarian ways have a voice, and so. I agree with Rousseau and many other dreamers of democracy who have come before us and are still with us, that if we had, if people have power, and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence, research that shows, if people have power and time and capacity to use it, they tend to do good things with it. They don't shrink away from political responsibility. We live in a culture, for example, where there's a great deal of apathy. But actually, when people engage in political power and find it valuable and useful and it changes things, people become unapathetic. They get engaged. They become passionate. And so I think when we want to know what motivates people in respect to what they do, and even those that we believe are harmful, and why they are where they are, and so on, if we engage them with respect and dignity and humility and courage and love, as much as we can do that, and we do so in a democratic context in various overlapping processes of democracy, I believe we can learn about one another with such power that the more harmful things some of us tend to do can be transmitted into, as Carl was saying earlier at the end of his remarks, transmitted into positive and constructive energies and what I call force fields and technologies. I don't think we have to give up on people. It's a mistake to give up on people and write people off and assume they'll always be weak or cowardly or stupid or immoral or whatever kinds of adjectives we might use to describe them. None of that is true about anyone. And I think we should always interact with other people as though they can be part of a liberationist moment and an emancipatory technology, that they can be part of the solution. Even if they decide to do so for selfish ways, they see it as their own best, the very best thing for themselves alone, that's okay. So I think there are ways to meet everybody in such a way that we can all be open to transformation. But all of that, which sounds kind of quasi-spiritual and so on, and for me it is, doesn't work against the howling and screaming that I just did a few minutes ago. That's true too. Both things can be true. I'm going to quit here in a minute, but I am in a tradition, I'm from a tradition and a community that tells us that we should speak the truth in love. And I take that to heart, not that I do it well, but I try to do it well. And I try to love the most unlovable of people, the people I love least of all, I try to love. But that doesn't mean I don't speak the truth as I understand it. They're not conflicting values or energies. They work together. And I think we can do that not only as individuals, but we can collectivize our energies and our moral imaginations and do it in social constructs as well. And I'll stop there.
Carl, you hands up for that? I'm marinating.
I think I would just say, in a very general term, yeah, I think the whole two-party system could benefit from a scramble. Of course, maybe it's too chaotic right now for that, but it might be a good challenge for our democracy and government to figure out what it means to build coalition governments with multiple political parties, more than two for sure. We also know that that can be really tough. There's places all over where there isn't governments for like 2 years because they can't come up with a coalition agreement. So I'm not naive in that thought. But I want to go back to where the change, I think happens. We bemoan the sort of arc towards in authoritarianism and populist leaders and dictatorial type of governments and so on. And that's true. But at the same time, if you're looking at global trends, there's tremendous numbers, more than ever in history, of nonviolent mobilized movements by citizens, civilians, and folks on the ground who are pushing, whether it's the People's First Movement, but there's so many movements now. And I think we need to understand that that's a outcome of this lack of governance, this governance that is no longer acceptable, and people are saying it's no longer acceptable. How do we support those movements? Because as someone else said, many of them haven't worked. Like there's been many that are named that don't work, but I think it's not because the intent wasn't right or the vision wasn't right. It might have been around organizing and mobilization skills and so on, but it also might be around how do we sustain these in the long run, and as the people being governed demand how we want to be governed. What we need to do is figure out a way, if we can, to bring these movements in conversation with these political parties. But it has to get to the point where the political parties feel like their very existence is threatened, probably, before they'll go into conversation that deep.
If I could just take 30 more seconds and then give this to Ray. I naturally, obviously, I would like to see many more political parties. That, for me, goes without saying. But on the other hand, I wish we lived in a country where we had one of them. Because in many ways, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party really aren't political parties. They're organizations of corporate power for particular purposes. They don't really operate in a democratic, in a political way by the likes of democratic politics. And the Democratic Party is much better than the Republican Party, but it still makes one gag if one cares about democracy and a better world. And then, the Democratic Socialists of America, they're not really even a party. They're just a coalition of people trying to speak in ways that prick the conscience of, their fellow Americans. And the Working Party, the Working Family, I'm blanking on the name, it's a good party, but it's minuscule. I mean, we in one sense, we need more parties, but in another, we just need one. It would be nice to have one. So we just have so much work to do.
I think an individual response to a systemic crisis is absurd, right? Like, I want to quit recycling because I've been recycling my whole life and I don't think it's getting us anywhere. But I'm not going to. Everybody calm down, I'm still recycling. I'm just saying, that I can recycle everything my whole life and one company's going to undo it in 3 hours, right? So I think individual solutions to systemic problems are kind of absurd, and it's the only way I know how to show up. And I think there are some people who are dragons, and dragons hoard. They hoard money, and they hoard power, and they hoard affluence. I think Jeff Bezos is a dragon. I also think Nancy Pelosi is a dragon. And I think that, I wish that we had leaders and structures and systems that were designed to train new leaders or trickle down affluence or spread power or pull enough people up that we disseminate power exponentially and it's not so powerful anymore. And I'm not exactly sure how to do that, but I do know that as you and I progress in our lives, we, for most people, get closer and closer to power, and proximity to power is actually really dangerous. And I feel like, in particular, particularly as a white woman in anti-racism training spaces, right? I've learned how dangerous that is, right? That the closer we get to the highest seats of power, the more likely we are to align ourselves with it and to start to other everyone else. And so, don't be a dragon is sort of my my final thing, right? Like, I think being really intentional as you do work, as we all do work and gain affluence and gain power and gain resources, to make sure that we're being really thoughtful about how we're using them, and make sure that that as we come into places where we have influence, where we have the mic, that we feel like, and we know that what we're doing is good with it, and that we're not trying to hoard our positions and our power and our wealth only for ourselves and our people.
We have other comments about this or additional comments? You're back in the back.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful panel. Really, I was struck by each of your remarks. Michael, wonderful to see you back in full force. And, there were several things that have been said. I kind of want to bring one of the bullet points that Michael mentioned into conversation with some of the practitioner aspect that you've been talking about kind of throughout, right? I think you just mentioned as a perfect example. So when we're talking about like shame, I think it's a very interesting thought virtue, I think you called it as well, and it also is tricky. I mean, my question kind of is, how do we cultivate a culture, rather than relying on exclusionary principles? I think that there is something important to shame, but I also wonder, what about the negative aspects of cancel culture? Obviously, there are some really serious implications that taking that behavior really too far, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but there are some serious implications to, like out-grouping, for example, which is part of the conversation, in terms of healing. Like, how can shame be a productive part of healing and not end up in, that more like negative cycle that we are seeing now with cancel culture? And, how does that apply in practice? How do we maybe cultivate a culture through nurturing? And can shame be a part of that still? I'm just really interested in bringing that particular bullet point to conversation with these other aspects we've talked about. So if you could maybe speak to any of the questions I mentioned, I would love that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I actually, when Mike was talking, I wrote, shame is not a tool for an objective measure, right, is what I was thinking, because I was thinking about my lived experiences and when I've been experienced shame, right, and I was thinking, well, but they were wrong, right, like that, right, and so I think that what's really interesting about it, right, is that Michael was talking about it being tied to an idea of virtue. I think that what we're really talking, also, I mean, it's not virtue, but I think what we're talking about in that is like identity and values, which we unpacked in my workshop quite a bit yesterday, right? How our identity and our values really shape how we show up in all different types of conflict, and even how we show up in non-conflict engagement. And I think that I think it's an interesting idea to say that we're gonna like shame people out of this, because I think that we would have to all be on the same side about what is shameful, right? Like what are our tolerances and what our standards are. And I think that I am regularly surprised to learn that people are unashamed of things that of positions, right, that I find really dangerous, that I would find shameful, that I wouldn't say out loud, that I wouldn't, that I think are like dangerous, bigoted, violent positions, right? And so I think that in order to find shame, what we'd have to do is unpack with an individual or maybe an organization what the underlying value is there that's trying to be actualized, and then I think we could take apart like how those two values don't meet. But I think that the way that I see it show up practically in my work is that it's just a tool for disengagement. And maybe sometimes that's the plan, right? Like we are going to disengage, right? We've decided that this behavior is unsatisfactory and unacceptable. But I think you raise a really good point about the consequences of cancel culture and what that can mean for all of us. So I I don't have a great answer for you, but I was wondering and kind of thinking about it myself, because I think it shows up in a lot of different ways. Carl, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, just a few. Thank you for that question. I think as a society, we're very allergic to shame. And I've often thought about that and wondered about that through a restorative justice lens. And two things I want to say on that. I mean, part of that is understandable. We can trace that back to the abuse of shame in some religious traditions, as well as we have a tendency, and maybe it has to do with individualistic societies, but we label and then we put shame upon people, and we don't give them an option or a way out. They carry it for the rest of their lives. And this is what we can learn from what I've experienced in many collectivist societies, as well as our First Nations peoples in North America, many of them, and I worked more closely with some from Canada around the peacemaking circles, and they didn't put shame on the agenda. We don't put it on the agenda. Now we're going to shame you. The process, if it's done well, where, as I said before, in Sierra Leone, when they were using a traditional process to deal with the atrocities of the war, the Sierra Leone villagers had a really articulate way of saying, these folks are human beings, they're part of our family. What they did was completely inhumane, and we believe we can restore their humanity if we can bring them back in the community and work with them through our social and spiritual and cultural capital and traditions and wisdoms and rituals. And they said it makes no sense to banish them because they have family and relatives who will want to avenge whatever, if we kill them or if we send them off to prison. So let's bring them into the community and bring back their humanity, restore their humanity through a process of accountability and other things, but within community. And I think that's what we don't have a process for. And our legal system shames through labels and sometimes for life. And so the First Nations folks in Canada talk about the current justice system as a degradation system, and that the Indigenous process is an attempt at an integrative system. John Braithwaite, who's one of the founding voices, Australian professor in the restorative justice field, has written and developed a theory around what he calls isolating or alienating shame, which is what I was describing, and what he believes is integrative shame, meaning we shouldn't throw shame out. It's a complicated human emotion like so many others, and it can lead to transformation and change, but it needs to be bounded. And there needs to be a way for people to be able to come back in to active participation in a community.
I've taught restorative justice, and I've written a lot about it, and I've practiced it, and I believe in it to every cell of my body. And I agree with what you just said, but we should recognize the humanity in everyone, and I mean everyone. But sometimes human beings do shameful things, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. It's not helpful at all. It's destructive. I mean, one might say you just shamed Pelosi and Musk or whoever. Bezos, yeah. You know, I mean, but that doesn't mean that we have to consider Pelosi and Bezos as people who are, we don't write them off. We don't think of them as forever shameful, but they just do some shameful things in our estimation. And they can change, as I said moments ago, and they might be heroic and deeply admirable in the future. And, you know, our shame, the sense we have of them as doing shameful things may change, and we'll regard them as great moral figures, as has happened throughout history a zillion times, you know. And, you know, think of a prison system, for example, the United States penal system. I don't think of the people behind bars as shameful. I think of our penal system as shameful. You know, I think the way we treat prisoners is shameful. I think of the way we do justice as shameful. You know, I don't callously and carelessly, think of the people behind bars as a bunch of dirty, shameful people. I think that people who make a lot of money and wear around the world feel shame in horribly pathological and I would call sinful ways. And they shouldn't feel shame. Of course, I'm not all for shame. Let's all shame one another. But, we have to think of how we're going to change our society in fundamental ways. And some things we do collectively, I believe, are shameful. And we have to talk about it that way. I mean, we got to use some kind of language,
Do you think that we would, I wonder that we wouldn't need a more agreement around the value that the shame is
Yeah,
against
but yeah, you said
That,
we'd
you
all
know what I
have to
mean?
agree. But of course,
Well,
we
that's
don't
what
all have to agree, just enough of us, right? And I'm serious. We don't all agree on anything.
But I don't think Jeff Bezos would feel ashamed if he knew
No,
that
of
I
course
thought
not.
he was shameful.
No, of course
Right,
not.
like I don't know that it's
He would
impactful
laugh.
if he and I don't have a shared value. That's what I think I meant.
Well, I mean, of course.
But it's
But
not about persuading.
if our society was a certain kind of society, and our culture were a certain kind of culture, where he felt a lot of people thought he was shameful, that might give him pause. That might.
So you're
have
talking
some
about
effect.
like the impact of collective but not universal value.
Sure. I mean, we don't. Just for example, we already have in our culture, not absolute consensus, but a great deal of agreement that some things are shameful. We could take a poll right now and there probably would not be one single dissenter. No one in this room would disagree that X is shameful if X were a certain thing, right? Raping a child is a shameful thing to do, for example. We'd all agree. So it's not that we can't come to, we don't, this goes into more philosophy, we don't have time for it. We don't have to have absolute agreement about what our moral values are. But we can have what was in another context called overlapping consensus about it. And we often do. We often do. Yes?
So I have a thought that if you would like to respond to, more than a question. I think quite a lot about this area that we've landed in, or that you've landed in this discussion. Thank you, sorry, my eyesight isn't great, so I don't know if I'll get all of your names correct. Mr. Minch on the end, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So the list that you gave of large-scale ideas are things that I and my peers discuss quite often, and it is very easy to get bogged down by the weight of the number of things that are going wrong right now, and to not know where to focus our attention, especially those of us that don't have any sort of significant power, and our communities are very small. And where I've been able to find hope is that my peers and many of the people around us have sort of found hope and healing, which I like what Mr. Stauffer, is that what his?
Stauffer.
Sorry, I apologize. I liked what you said about trauma, because that seems to be where we've found hope on an individual level, is sort of going through these healing processes. And many of what myself and my peers have had to heal from is sort of this very real shame of having inherited a world where we are children of the oppressors. We were raised in an environment where we are very represented, and have had to reckon with the reality that where we have benefited, many have been wounded. And so the question that I sort of sit with is, how can we, rather than shaming people, sort of acknowledge the shame and just simply admitting that reality,
and how we can sort of build a larger story around healing rather than pointing fingers. I mean, the pointing fingers kind of needs to happen to some level, of course, because we need to acknowledge problems that have just festered below the surface for generations now and keep rearing their head in new ways. Yeah, so that's basically the thought I sit with, is how can we sort of take that healing into a larger story? Because that sort of seems like what our country is missing right now, is we don't actually know who we are. And I don't really know that we have a story of what we're all building towards at this point. We all know what we're mad about and what we're terrified of. And like right now, it just seems like this weighty fear of totalitarianism that is just knocking on the door. So, like, what is a story that we could build that could bring hope on a larger scale, if that makes sense?
I like the one that Clayton offered, which every religion and every culture in the world that I'm aware of says to itself, which is that if I love something, I should love it for everyone. If I want something, I should want it for everyone. You know, in the Christian tradition, sometimes that's called the golden rule. You know, but in any case, it's a universal moral principle that we should all want everything I want for myself, I should want for everybody else. That's a nice ground out of which to grow a vision. I just want to say a quick word about hope, because you mentioned that. I don't think there's any way to live a human life that's not hopeless and one that isn't rather desperate, unless a person is like really cold and shut down, without being a part of a community of hope. I think all of us should be a part of a community of hope, where we work with others side by side, shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. We live our lives in such a way that they know us, we know them, and when they're weak, we'll be strong for them, and when we're weak, they'll be strong for us, and we'll bear one another's burdens, we'll hold one another up, and we'll work together for a better world. And living like that in solidarity with others is actually what generates and produces hope. That's a hope generator. That's where hope comes from, you know, is living like that. So I think it's essential that we live lives like that, all of us. Or else, I don't know how people don't just collapse otherwise. That's what I think.
We are virtually out of time, and actually out of time. We did not intend, with the Healing Conversations workshops and conference, to end the conversation today. The intent was that this is the place to begin the conversation and to move it forward. And I am grateful to all of our presenters, because I feel that you have moved the conversation forward, and we are deeply indebted to you. And I also, just quickly, the magnificence of universities is that this can be the home for these kinds of conversations, where they can be engaged in safely and aggressively. And I appreciate your comments and what you have presented today, because I feel that this is an excellent example of that safe place to express important and sometimes controversial ideas. I'd like to have you give a round of applause for the panel, and then we hope that you will continue the conversation as you leave here and go forward, that it won't end here. Thank you.